Morgan Myers, a hardworking real estate consultant, has been taken for granted by her family, especially her sister Brittany, for years. After quietly building a successful business and selling the family house, Morgan reveals the sale at a family dinner where Brittany had announced she'd be moving in. The reveal humiliates Brittany and fractures family ties. Morgan later becomes the keynote speaker at a major industry gala, publicly proving her success. The fallout forces the family to confront its assumptions. Morgan sets boundaries, negotiates repayment from Brittany, and starts a fragile process of reconciliation while continuing to grow professionally. The fairy fog clung to the waterfront like a hush. Inside the bistro, low jazz and silverware kept time, but the table felt suspended, 12 faces angled toward Brittany as if she'd just announced the cure for something. She held her flute at a practice tilt, grin wide enough to hold the room. "Mom and Dad said we can move into Morgan's house," she declared, eyes sweeping for the approving chorus. Morgan watched the light catch on the rim of the glass and didn't flinch. She noticed the tiny scuff inside her left ring finger where a ring had once rubbed. Small things anchored her better than applause. Around her, family members murmured congratulations as though a property transfer was a fait accompli. Her mother squeezed her hand and whispered, "You're such a good sister." The words landed like an anchor, meant to tether Morgan to a role she'd outgrown. You could call it a pattern. From grade school to grad school, Morgan had been the one who quietly did the work. Brittany took center stage, the lead in the play, the surprise car, the sympathy when she found herself. Morgan had learned how to smile and disappear, how to become the seam that made everyone else's outfit look whole. She'd learned how to manage other people's expectations until they felt like her own. Tonight, they'd all be spectators. She'd let them. The first memory that came was of the Greenwood house, narrow porch, crooked mailbox, the earnest hope of a 25-year-old who signed a mortgage with hands that thought laterality was a metaphor for courage. Her parents had called it a family achievement. They'd said they helped her buy it, their favorite phrase hung around holidays like garlands. There were receipts, emails, a bank account that could prove the loan had been repaid. Proof lived in cold numbers. Feelings, however, are volcanic and slow to change. Brittany was telling the story of future yoga mornings and the kids' rooms as if the house were a communal shrine. No one asked if Morgan wanted prayer or pilgrimage. No one asked if the house was even hers anymore. Not really. It didn't matter. Habits are lazy things. People prefer the comfortable lie. Morgan's water flute made a tiny chime against the glass when she lifted it. Let them celebrate, she thought. Let them assume. Then, quietly, like the practiced professional she was when negotiating 50-page contracts, she set the glass down and slid her phone toward Brittany without looking. The contract was simple in its finality, a stamped, notarized PDF with a closing date visible and a number large enough to make math feel unnecessary. She could feel the air change, the applause dim into a collective intake. The edges of Brittany's smile sharpened, then emptied. Her husband's relief curdled into confusion. Everyone's gaze landed on Morgan like a beam finding its target. "I sold it," Morgan said, voice steady, finished, neither celebratory nor apologetic. Words are tools. She picked the one that made a room stop. The table stilled. The waterfront's hum retreated. What began as a rehearsed life for everyone else turned, on the spot, into a scene that tested the family's assumptions. In that silence there was a recalibration. Morgan no longer fit the role they'd designed for her. What they clutched as truth had shifted into undeniable, written proof. And outside, beyond the fogged panes, the city kept going, indifferent, enormous, and waiting for her next move. When the laughter thinned and Brittany fled, the room filled with the debris of small shocks, napkins, half-eaten scallops, a pulse of conversations that died in the mouth. Morgan left cash for her share and walked home with a low, steady feeling she'd only recently learned to name: relief. It wasn't triumph so much as an unmooring of obligation. For the first time in a long while, the world felt porous enough to let her through. Back in her penthouse, light spilled across a floor she picked and paid for. The skyline was a punctuation mark she had finally earned. There were practical things to do: revise the slides for a keynote, approve renderings of the waterfront project, coordinate with attorneys, but Morgan let herself breathe. She called Elena, her co-founder and closest ally, not to celebrate but to be held in the ordinary. I slid the closing across the table. Silence, then laughter, then that exact, practical voice she loved. Good, Elena said. Now go make them watch. Work had always been Morgan's refuge and battleground. She and Elena started with 2 chairs in a cramped office and built structure from scraps, spreadsheets, late-night calls, a stubborn belief that integrity yields leverage. Myers and Associates was the map of their own proving. The firm's growth wasn't a lottery ticket, it was compound interest on discipline. By the time Morgan cleared nearly $1 million after selling the house, she had no illusions about applause. She wanted to be recognized for labor, not lineage. News trickled in like weather. Text messages flicked on and off, angry, confused, consolatory. Her mother's voicemail felt manufactured sympathy. Her father's message contained disappointment like a passive verb. Brittany's "You're cruel" landed twice as harsh on screens because it demanded performance. An apology, a tear, returned to the old script. Morgan didn't give them that stage. Instead, she planned. A public reveal at the Cascade Development Partnership Gala would be the crescendo she and her team had choreographed for months, not to punish, but to place a fact where it could no longer be denied. Her name appeared on the program. Her keynote would not be about family revenge, it would be about a $15 million vision for the waterfront and about the team that earned it. Between calls with Richard Caldwell, the mentor who'd become a partner, and edits to the project timeline, Morgan rehearsed phrasing that felt honest and contained. She would present numbers that mattered: jobs, community impact, sustainable materials. She would speak about vision, not grudges. Success, she reminded herself, returns with dignity when you let it speak loudest. But the private life hummed underneath like a subwoofer. Doubts surfaced in small ways, a replay of her father's tightening jaw, the memory of nights when she withheld accomplishments because family had turned them into bargaining chips. Setting boundaries was not a single act, it was an ongoing practice that required muscle she'd only recently started to build. The real work was not the pitch deck, it was retaining composure, while the people who should have been her champions learned to see her differently. Screenshots collected like evidence: Brittany's Instagram, mother's vague Facebook post, a friend's LinkedIn share with phrases like proud and honored that made the breath in Morgan's chest loosen. Elena, practical and fierce, sent an emoji that read, "Let them come. Let the work do the talking." When families misremember you as you once were, public truth can be a medicine and a mirror. At home, Morgan ironed a charcoal suit and black silk blouse. It is a small, deliberate ritual, clothes as armor, not disguise. She wanted to feel unflappable. She wanted to speak and know she had said what needed saying. Tomorrow the stage would be bright, and the city's important people would be listening. Her family would be in the room, too, unprepared for the truth scaffold in slides and signatures. For the first time, she imagined what it would feel like to be seen without having to ask. The gala was a theater of small formalities: linens, name cards, practice smiles. Morgan watched her family check in from the wings, mother's nervous smile, father's flinch when he read the program, Brittany's pink dress and flippant selfie posture. They settled at a prominent table, front left, the kind of spot that showed off a family with nothing to hide. From backstage, Morgan felt a pocket of something close to terror and another like relief rubbing shoulders. On stage, the spotlight turned everything two-dimensional. Glasses shimmered, jaws softened, and the audience leaned into a narrative of civic revival. Morgan began the keynote the way she'd planned, a measured description of the waterfront project, renderings that transformed a derelict strip into a living place, numbers calibrated to sound like promise instead of bravado. She spoke of jobs and schools and river edges that could belong to people who currently had none. The room listened because the idea mattered. But halfway through, a question from a journalist shifted the theater's axis. What does this mean for the firm leading the vision? The audience wanted a person to fit the title. Richard gestured. The spotlight seemed to widen. For Morgan, The moment was not a trap, it was confirmation. Her introduction, the mention of Myers and Associates, had landed with weight. She used it. It means someone who built this from 2 desks, 3 clients, and a belief we could do better, she said. It means we refuse to wait for permission. The applause that followed felt like a physical force. In the first row, Morgan watched her mother's hands lift to her face. Tears or a sudden embarrassment, she couldn't tell. Brittany's phone buzzed, then fell still. For the first time, the program's type had become a map. Names scrawled in ink altered how people navigated their assumptions. Then the midpoint twist arrived, not through scandal, but through human fracture. In the reception's bar, in a softer light, Brittany intercepted Morgan, not in public spectacle, but in a corner where their private history could echo. "Why didn't you tell me?" she demanded, the question ragged. "Why would you do this to me?" It was accusation softened into hurt. Morgan could have answered with a speech. Instead, she chose microtruths, the years of unpaid loans, the dented car returned without apology, the countless requests that asked more than Morgan could afford and diminished her every time she spoke about her work. She named specifics, crisp and unembellished. Facts, she'd learned, function like a scalpel. They cut what's false and leave what's real. But the real twist wasn't the money or the house. It was watching Brittany look at her sister as if seeing her for the first time. The shock hit both ways. Morgan realized that the family's vision of her had been a political economy, roles assigned, debts unpaid, cheerleading expected. Brittany realized she'd been operating on assumptions, not knowledge. When Brittany's apology finally arrived, blurred, half-formed, and defensive, something brittle shifted. She claimed embarrassment, not wrongdoing. Morgan understood then that apology without accountability was an old currency in the family ledger, a public gesture that bought silence without repayment. She set another boundary that night: no reconciliation without tangible change. Backstage after the Q&A, the conference buzzed with praise and opportunity. Deals were whispered, names exchanged, and Richard clasped her elbow with the fondness of someone who'd watched a slow burn reach ignition. Yet for Morgan, victory tasted like dust if her home life tasted of betrayal. Success felt finally like a ledger that matched her effort. It did not replace the ache of being misunderstood. The midpoint's true turn was quieter than a scandal. It was an internal recalibration. Morgan's family was reaching for explanations. She was reaching for dignity. One required explanation. The other required enforcement. She chose enforcement, boundaries made manifest, terms written and offered, not to punish, but to make further requests impossible without consent. And in the hum of the reception, beneath the orchestra of congratulations, Morgan understood a new truth. You can hold both pride and grief simultaneously, and that is how you build a life that belongs to you. After the gala, the world rewound and replayed the key frames: the handshake photo in the Seattle Business Journal, the LinkedIn buzz, and her mother's tentative text, "Can we talk?" Public accolades multiplied like echoes, but the private dialogue required choreography and, above all, firmness. Morgan moved with intention. She composed a family agreement, 5 simple points typed onto a single sheet. Respect boundaries. No comparisons. Debt repayment terms. Scheduled visits. No public airing of private wounds. The formality was a response to a long history of casual intrusions and assumed ownership. A boundary is only useful when it's visible. The paper gave the rules weight. When she slid the printout across the cafe table at their first formal sit-down, she watched her father's knuckles whiten. Her mother's eyes overflowed with something apologetic and hesitant. Brittany read the terms and flinched, like someone spotting the edge of a cliff beneath a familiar footpath. The crescendo was not cinematic, it was bureaucratic, boring documentation that demands follow-up. Brittany promised $500 a month toward the $15,000. It was a number that fit within the family's old currency, manageable enough to be touted as progress, significant enough to require behavior change. Morgan wasn't looking for theatrics, she wanted repair measured in accountability. Days became ritualized tests. Thanksgiving, scheduled with an exit plan, felt like the first exam. Morgan granted them 2 to 6 hours, a finite presence that kept nostalgia from morphing into martyrdom. For a while, everything held. No veiled critiques about marriage or children, no comparisons when conversation turned to careers. Her parents called less like lobbyists and more like people learning new social rules. The house she sold was never again a bargaining chip on holiday menus. But the old currents didn't die overnight. December brought a request for preschool tuition from Brittany, an ask Morgan had anticipated and declined. The refusal rippled outward, her mother called, a mixture of guilt and family ethic pulling at her voice. Morgan listened, then repeated the agreement's terms. Helping for children's sake was reasonable. Ceding financial sovereignty to a pattern of dependence was not. The exchange made the stakes plain. Boundaries require repetition. Meanwhile, the business accelerated. Myers and Associates signed consultations worth millions. The office acquisition, raw exposed brick and plate glass windows, was a public claim staked in the city's heart. The firm's work generated real community promises. They weren't transactionally building wealth, they were building public infrastructure. Work was an anchor, but it was also a mirror, an externalization of Morgan's internal boundaries. These were the projects she would steward, the vision she'd defend. In the middle of professional success, Morgan kept encountering small, revealing gestures from her family. An aunt's sudden enthusiasm that arrived too late, a cousin's comment on LinkedIn that read like a retrospectively altering narrative, and Jason's hesitant apology message. These signals read like attempts to retrofit their perception of her. Morgan accepted small apologies, but remained wary of the pattern, performative warmth followed by the old habits. Brittany's progress was a slower arc. Therapy gave her language, jealousy, projection, identity crisis, but Morgan needed more than words. She needed muscle memory from made decisions. $500 arrived in Morgan's account one month, then another, then a note of gratitude. Apology emails arrived, then a conversation that actually lasted. These small acts formed a sequence, like breadcrumbs through a forest. They didn't guarantee trust, but they mapped a route. The build toward the climax was not a single confrontation. It was a series of tests, one after another, that made the family choose whether to change. Morgan's strength came not from a dramatic takedown but from relentless consistency. The accumulation of small refusals, clarified expectations, and professional credibility put pressure on the family's old stories until some of them gave way. On the eve of a major client kickoff, Morgan sat alone in the new office as dusk made the windows bronze. She thought about the contract she'd slid across that bistro table months earlier, how such a simple act had rerouted years of expectation. The climax was coming, not as revenge, but as a reckoning. Everything she'd been building, in business and in life, would demand that the family show up differently or not at all. She picked up her phone and typed, "Dinner Sunday? 2 hours." It was small, a test disguised as civility. This time, she wouldn't be the default yes. Sunday arrived like a chapter marker. Morgan reserved the table at a quiet Italian place, neutral ground, no one's living room to be invaded. Her parents came with a mixture of humility and guarded hope. Brittany arrived last, hair pulled back, eyes raw but steady. For a suspended minute, the table was simply family in a public room. The air was charged, but not electric, it felt human. Morgan placed the printed family agreement in the center of the table and let silence do the work. Her father read each line with slow, private deliberation, the kind that suggests a mind weighing something larger than pride. Her mother's face was an open map of regret and longing. Brittany sat with folded hands, possibly rehearsing whatever defense she might make, possibly prepared to surrender. "You asked us for rules," her mother said finally, voice small. "You asked for boundaries." "I did," Morgan said. "I asked for honesty, for respect, for a plan that makes sense. Not ultimatums. Not punishment. Just clarity." The moment felt like an incision. Morgan told the story, not the long laundry list of resentments, but the specifics that meant everything. The loans that weren't repaid, the car returned with dents, the assumptions about a house she'd bought with her own money. Each detail landed like evidence, and unlike before, she did not soften them into explanations. She framed the harms not as proof of villainy, but as breaches of trust. Her voice was steady, because this was a ledger she could no longer fold into apologies. Brittany's response was not cinematic at first. It was small and human. "I'm sorry," she said, and the words trembled like a newly learned instrument. "I don't want to be the kind of person who takes from her family and hides behind being mom. I was ashamed, and I made you my excuse." She looked at Morgan directly. "I'll pay the $500. I'll go to therapy. I know I have to earn your trust." Morgan assessed the amalgam of apology for sincerity. The past had been littered with words that evaporated. But tonight, there was evidence. Transfers posted, a text notifying of each payment, a therapist's check-in message glimpsed in her Instagram story. Small acts were now building architecture. Her father wiped his eyes and, in a halting voice, said, "We were wrong. We thought we were helping. But looking back, I see we put you in a role, Morgan. We treated you like a safety net instead of, we didn't listen. I'm sorry." The apology sounded like old timber giving way. In that instant, the family's dynamic reshaped. It wasn't magic. It was negotiation and accountability, and the kind of mundane consistency that is harder than drama. Morgan accepted the apology while keeping the agreement on the table as testament. She wanted change to be measurable, not sentimental. The climax crystallized when Brittany reached across and took Morgan's hand, not in supplication but in solidarity. "I'll do the work," she said. "I want to be better." The gesture was small and imperfect. The wound would take time. Forgiveness, Morgan thought, is not binary. It is an ongoing set of decisions. What mattered in the apex was the arrival of willingness. Willingness to pay, to attend therapy, to stop posting private grievances as public theater. That day, they made choices that anchored hope in method. Walking home that night, Morgan felt the strange twin currents of grief and relief. There had been no explosive rupture, no cinematic vengeance. Instead, there was a careful, human pivot, family choosing to be accountable and a woman refusing to erase herself for the comfort of others. The climax landed in the quiet exchange of obligations fulfilled and promises kept. She opened the door to her penthouse, and the city unfolded below, not a backdrop to prove anything, but a place she had helped shape. Above the skyline, she allowed herself a small, private smile. Victory was not in their capitulation, but in mutual labor, the hard, everyday work of re-earning trust and safeguarding self. Time doesn't tidy up all the loose ends at once. It threads them through ordinary days, monthly transfers showing up like small acts of penance, phone calls that now start with, "How are you?" instead of requests, calendar invites that carry boundaries as a norm. The family chat, once a noisy marketplace of memes and passive comparisons, became quieter, more purposeful. When Brittany posted her first real progress photo of the yoga studio, she captioned it without the usual performative needle, 2 months of work. "Thanks for the study reminders." She didn't tag Morgan. Morgan kept the family agreement in a drawer, not as a weapon, but as a reminder that good intentions require paperwork and practice. On a Tuesday afternoon, she walked past the firm's new sign, Myers and Associates, and thought of the brick and the ribbon cutting, of Elena's laugh when their first client called to say yes. She'd built a space where work had purpose and was not a bargaining chip in a family ledger. There were moments of slipperiness. A holiday when old habits crept back, a text message from her mother that read more like a plea than a check-in. Morgan handled the slippage the way she handled transactions, with clarity, sometimes with firmness, occasionally with grace. She learned to choose which fights deserved oxygen and which were old fires that needed no fanning. Brittany kept going to therapy. Jason found part-time work and, awkward but steady, began to contribute financial updates. They sent photos of the kids' school concerts instead of passive-aggressive pleas. Those images were small proof that human beings can relearn how to be generous without entitlement, provided they do the work. Professionally, Morgan's life continued on an upward arc. The waterfront project moved from slides to construction meetings, then to groundbreakings. Myers and Associates grew not out of spectacle, but because the firm solved friction in complicated projects. Morgan's leadership style, calm, exacting, and humane, became the core of her reputation. Invitations came for panels and podcasts where she spoke about boundaries, about leadership and ethics, about how to build organizations that didn't replicate toxic family dynamics. One evening, months later, she walked into the yoga studio Brittany had finally opened. The room smelled faintly of eucalyptus. Sunlight made a lattice on the floor. Brittany greeted her with an unshowy hug. Kids ran around, sticky with juice and safe at last. As she watched, Morgan felt no tug to take control or to rescue. She felt something quieter, the soft satisfaction of a boundary that allowed both of them to practice different versions of success. They had both changed. Brittany's apology had been the beginning, not the end. Morgan's willingness to be present on her terms allowed repair to become work rather than performance. Family dinners still required an agenda, sometimes even a script, but they were less theatrical and more human. They argued. They celebrated. They misstepped. They tried again. On a cool spring evening, Morgan stood on the rooftop of the office building with Elena, looking over the city, cranes and ferries, and a skyline that no longer felt like a distant dream. "Do you regret it?" Elena asked, nodding at the whole trajectory. The house sale, the gala, the agreement. Morgan considered, then shook her head. "No," she said. "I don't regret protecting my life. I don't regret asking for respect. I regret some things, sure. The lost years of being invisible, but not the choice to make it different." She thought of the tiny scuffs on her fingers, the ring that no longer fit, and how those small marks had charted a course toward integrity. Her phone buzzed, a text from her mother, an invitation to dinner, not a demand, that read, "No pressure. We'd love to see you." Morgan typed back, "I'll be there. 5 to 8. She paused, then added, "Love you." She hit send and felt the word settle where it belonged, chosen, not coerced. The city lights blurred into a soft smear of gold as the ferry horns called offshore. Morgan breathed and let the moment stand, imperfect, ongoing, human. She had not broken the family. She had not burned it down. Instead, she taught it a new grammar: consent, responsibility, and respect. That grammar would not fix everything overnight, but it offered a structure for future repair. She turned away from the skyline, the office behind her humming with life. Tomorrow would bring meetings, challenges, small decisions. Tonight, there was a quiet dinner to prepare and a life to inhabit. Her life, boundary-built and care-wrought, steady as a city that never stopped being made.